All right. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Ryan King White from Towson University. There we go. All right. The lingering effects of COVID-19 on the world of commercial sport may have been frustrating for fans, workers, organizations, and the like. But what has often been written out of this discussion is the impact of COVID-19 on youth sport. Public and for-profit youth sport programming, a cottage industry and seeming rite of passage for many children and their parents in the United States, was quite simply devastated. Throughout the early portions of the shutdown, local community-run rec programs were shuttered across the country. Highly competitive travel teams, leagues, and training programs were canceled, and for a time, many public parks across the country were deemed off limits by rule of law. With K-12 schools quickly shifting from in-person instruction to online learning platforms, children suddenly had no regular access to playground time, limited or no physical contact with other kids, and no sporting outlet to expend their considerable energy reserves anywhere but in their own homes. Outside of esports, iPad games, and massive multiplayer internet platforms like Roblox, all was quiet, but it did not last forever. As of this writing, and these numbers are a little off, millions have been infected, perished, and/or had their lives forever altered by the pandemic in a variety of ways. For much of March 2020 to 2021, families of all types were forced to essentially shelter in place for an extended period of time as schools, restaurants, large gatherings, and other forms of external human group contact were reduced to a variety of pixelated cellular and electronic communications. Lockdowns, travel restrictions, and a whole host of other impediments were erected in an effort to slow the spread of the virus long enough for a vaccine to be developed. And while such policies mostly followed the science and were in the best interest of all, the emotional and psychological strain experienced by children and their parents is one of the primary horrors of the still ongoing pandemic. In this presentation, I'm going to utilize a brief narrative vignette and critical analysis to discuss the still evolving realities of youth sport in pandemic times, especially in terms of the emotional geographies of sport and physical culture that my wife and I traversed with our children during this time. As part of this project, I'm going to engage with the unease that I've negotiated fatherhood with in the contemporary moment, essentially raising what Margaret Hagerman would characterize in her book, White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America, as children who are growing up with, quote, upper middle class privilege in a society where private wealth shapes the experiences, opportunities, and outcomes that follow such childhoods of privilege, end quote. And while I additionally recognize that my positionality as white, cisgendered, heterosexual, and dad to 3 children within such a socioeconomic dynamic, especially one in which I benefit from whilst also trying to critique, will not mirror the experiences of everyone, there's a need for multiple, if not competing, accounts of these pandemic times. Now, debates about the best way to manage a nation's health have persisted for years. The American healthcare system, enmeshed deeply in late capitalism and big P politics, has long been celebrated within the United States for its ability to produce advances in treatments for a variety of medical issues. However, the weaknesses in this approach have also become quite clear during the bungled management of the COVID-19 pandemic. The New York Times, I'm quoting the New York Times here, stated, early numbers have shown that Black and Latino people have been harmed by the virus at higher rates. But the new federal data made available after the Times sued the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reveals a clearer and more complete picture. Black and Latino people have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus in a widespread manner that spans the country throughout hundreds of counties and urban, suburban, and rural areas and across all age groups. Thus, those feeling the brunt of the pandemic are coming from racially and economically disadvantaged populations. Disparities in populations' access to a better quality of life do not begin and end with COVID-19. Indeed, these differences are witnessed and experienced across numerous sites: healthcare, education, childcare, and physical activity, to name a few. Scholars often seek out ways to reach these populations in order to provide methods to inform and care for those who do not have readily available access in a system so entangled in late capitalist sensibilities. Such activist work is difficult for numerous reasons, but namely systemic change requires both helping the underserved while also convincing the privileged to relinquish or at least share access to opportunity. I've struggled with my place in this system as an individual, father, husband, and academic, and someone who grew up in rural upstate New York. on welfare, and took advantage of a lot of public provisions. Borrowing from extensive work on utilizing narrative as a form of inquiry with which to better understand contemporary socio-political questions, I aim to make linkages between politics, socialization, and my family. In the spring of 2020, I was dealing with a personal health issue, and in some ways not, well positioned to parent during the COVID-19 shutdowns regarding free time. I was out of teaching for the semester and had already met my annual scholarship goals. But working through this mental health condition also meant being stuck inside with 3 kids and my wife all day with no end in sight. Lost was any semblance of privacy or freedom, and it was replaced with school scheduling, preparation, and cleanup of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. Worse, even outdoor physical activities were closed down by the state of Maryland from late March to early May. All youth sports were also shuttered. Gone was a season of baseball, softball, and dance. Summer swim teams, camps, and soccer were canceled for the fall, and for a time we turned to daily neighborhood bike rides as our sole reprieve from the day-to-day monotony. Compounding matters, my wife and I, my own parents, live out of state, and neither of us have close family members. We saw her parents for the second time in a year in May of 2021 and visited with my parents for the first time in June of 2021. So the only place we actually had the privilege of really going to in the last year and utilizing for safe, quote unquote, physical activity, and you'll see not all of it was perfect, was a country club that we were able to join at a steep discount as a perk for working at an institution where our men's and women's golf teams practice. That summer, there were strict quotas on who could use the pool, members only, no guests, and for how long, 2 and then later 3-hour time blocks. And then we would all be kicked out and it would be disinfected for the next session. For a time, indoor dining was suspended and the restaurant operated as carryout or poolside only. Still, we spent nearly every single non-rainy day during the summer of COVID at the pool where the kids met up and swam with about 6 to 10 other kids in that picture. Those are the friends. All summer long. This is what we had, and we were fortunate enough to have had that, and fortunate we were. We tried the tennis courts a few times as a thing to do, but the one physical activity outside of the pool that really got us through this deeply insular period was golf. Years prior to joining the country club, our son, who's at 10 is the oldest, demonstrated a unique interest in the game, as I would take him to the local municipal course to play on the putting green for free, as we rotated through weekly activities like the zoo, science center, Trader Joe's, all the stuff that you can do with kids. So having played the sport in some form since he was 2, Colin has acquired a level of skill and interest in the sport, and his younger sisters have followed suit. Linked deeply with class division, particularly golf of the country club variety, this choice is one that I struggle with from a political, ethical, and moral standpoint. However, my children, wife, and I have grown to love the game in spite of ourselves. From a more positive viewpoint, golf is looked at by many, especially during COVID, as a safe outdoor lifetime sport where you can log 6 to 8 miles over 18 holes and can serve as a fill-in and or new passion in physical activity and competition lost at indoor sites of physical activity. Following a CNN report, we aren't the only ones to have turned to golf since all forms of golf, sales, viewership, rounds played, and country club memberships soared in the last year. Ours at Eagles Nest increased from 330 to about 450 in the last year. These participation numbers are akin to late 1990s Tiger Mania. This carried over to competitive youth golf as my children had experienced prior to COVID playing on the Baltimore City golf tour. It was basically you go and play golf 9 holes, pretty easy setups at the city courses and get a hot dog at the end, make a few friends. There'd be about 4 to 6 kids in each age group, and it was usually the same kids each summer. And it was pretty fun. But these were canceled by COVID. And what came in was the for-profit Under Armour Junior Tour. In our area, registration for the tour was about $395, and they sold out in about 24 to 48 hours for the summer and fall seasons. Much different from city events, this was high competition, and our kids were badly outmatched as they had never received any formal individual lessons outside of camps or group offerings, and their equipment was bottom rung brands that we bought simply so they could play. But they did get better, so much better that in fall 2020, Colin and our daughter Meredith qualified to play in the national championship events at IMG Academy and in Disney World in Florida. But this is where some of the stuff and some of the challenges with being a parent during this period come into play. We hadn't visited family. We hadn't left the area. We had done not very much at all. And so we chose basically to not send them. We basically got them a few nicer golf clubs as a payment, I guess. So time and again, local, state, and national representatives, as well as business people and fellow citizens, demonstrated an aversion to caring about the health of one another when life was reduced to getting through the day alive so we could watch Tiger King or binge seasons of Ozark at night. Caring for children during this period left us wanting for answers, as the general parenting experience is wont to do in relatively normal times. Upon reflection, what would have been considered best practices for raising kids in a morally and ethically sound manner during the pandemic? Should we have taken our time set aside for the pool and golf in a family unit to volunteer our services as unvaccinated people to unvaccinated others in desperate need of food, clothing, and shelter, for example? Should we never have left our houses under any circumstances? These and thousands more questions would yield disparate responses from even those within our own physical cultural studies community, without venturing across the aisle, as it were, to get to those with a more get back to normal socio-political outlook. As this defector article, you may see the response to that about the return to college football. Yeah, handling these things as parents the best we could does not feel entirely right either. Perhaps it is at this juncture that I must simply admit that the privilege to make these choices is in and of itself part of the disquiet that made getting through the pandemic even more difficult. There were no right choices other than the ones that ended with us coming out the other side with our children and family alive. What an awful place that was and is to be. I hope this vignette demonstrates some of the more mundane and, dare I say, instructive aspects for how inequality to basic physical culture came to be experienced during the height of the COVID pandemic. From a deeply cynical perspective, they could be viewed simply as the introspective musings of a 40-something semi-liberal white guy who, when push came to shove, took advantage of their relatively privileged lives during a period of time when so many were losing jobs, protesting police brutality, going hungry, getting sick, and even dying. However, when located within this context of a neoliberal moment in a country represented by a delusional demigod who placed public health at the bottom of his list of things to consider during the pandemic, and where the major alternative was Joe Biden, it makes sense that these were our experiences. P.S. Our daughter broke the pool record for the 25-meter butterfly, and with all 5 of us vaccinated, as of this presentation, we are going to Florida as our son helps represent Baltimore in the Under Armour National Championship. Thank you.